Well, good morning. And I think that all of nature has conspired with us to make it the most resplendent possible day so that we can share some very resplendent individuals. I'm going to begin this morning by speaking about 7 different great mystical poets. Before I do that, I want to very much thank the Fintry Fund for inviting me here and allowing me to speak with you. And I hope that we can share some of the most beautiful mystical poetry that has ever been written. One of the points of having chosen such a variety of poets from the great religious traditions, the Christian, the Sufi, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, is to precisely bring us to the understanding that once a soul reaches the point of communion with God in a mystical experience, that it goes beyond all doctrine and all dogma. It goes beyond the time in history, the culture, even the individuality of the soul which is experiencing this. And we're finding that, in fact, the experience is one and the same in all cases. And this came to me as something of a surprise because perhaps not all of us were raised to think that all religious paths or all spiritual paths really lead to the same end. Some people seem to be a little more exclusivistic. They may think they have a monopoly of the Holy Spirit, to the deprivation of others. But in fact, we see that it all concords. Where the problem comes in is not so much in the experience. It comes in the expression of the experience, because language can never capture the mystical experience of union of the soul with God. And St. John of the Cross explains that the reason for that is that nothing created, and language is a created thing, can bring us to the Creator directly. We can talk about it, we can talk around it, we can at best stammer and try to reach some kind of a communication, because when the soul has entered into communion with God, then it also understands that everything that exists, all souls that exist, that we are bound to them in a very intimate way, and that we want to communicate the lights or the experiences that we have had. This problem comes up with Paul, St. Paul in his epistles, where after having gone to the third heaven, he says, eye has not seen and ear has not heard what God reserves for his elect. That, in other words, we don't even have words in our language or languages capable of saying the things that are seen, because it doesn't correspond to what we have here on earth, except in a symbolic way, except in a kind of a material way. That there's a great gap between the two. Mind you, though all of these poets keep repeating to us that they can't say anything about these experiences, they all try very hard to talk about it. But they say nothing about it can be said. They go on for centuries writing about the things that can't be said, you see. And in Islam, for example, Ibn Arabi not only considers that we cannot reach the Creator through the created, their idea is that the things that are matter come from Iblis, which is the devil in Mohammedan teaching, Muslim teaching. It comes from Iblis, and so any attempt to describe things that are divine are already under the shadow of the evil one, you see, from their perspective. Because in Islam, God is so transcendent that God cannot enter directly into communication with man. And so man cannot talk about these things that he can't even experience. And we're going to see this afternoon, for example, how despite the strictures, the limitations that Muslim theologians have placed upon the relationship between the soul and God. In fact, its greatest mystics and mystical poets have gone beyond the theologians' limitations. Because it is only the divine cannot be changing. See, the divine, the transcendent cannot be changing. That all of the attributes and the oppositions are contained within it, but the divine cannot go from one to another. So if the divine begins to relate to individual souls, it can only do so in a limited way and therefore limiting itself. And this is part of the problem that mystics talk about in their problem. So, as I say, the mystical poets all pretty much concede that you cannot talk about the experience of the soul, because the soul at that point becomes deified or divinized, that which is potential within us becomes realized. And so we enter into a different dimension, so to speak, different relationship. However, John of the Cross is a bit more lenient, even though he seems to be more strict, because he admits that beginners need images. Beginners need words to somehow create the fire within them that will lead them to that experience. That any kind of image or poem or something is nothing but a pointer. It's but a sign along the route. For example, if you're driving to London and you see a sign pointing London, the sign tells you where you have to go, but the sign is not London. Just as the poem is not the experience of God. And so we must always bear this in mind and try to let the fire that is contained within these words, within these signs, take hold within us. And I'm sure many of you have already, perhaps all, have already had some kind of mystical experience. And certainly these poems are not of a nature to diminish those experiences. There comes a point, you see, where the words can be inspired. And in fact, the great religions all speak of inspired scripture, which has somehow filtered through the human psyche and the individual human person. And we see differences in personality. For example, a prophet Isaiah does not write in the same way that Jeremiah writes. Each description is tinted. I won't say tainted, I'll say tinted with the personality, the culture, the experience of the individual. But the inspiration is from the same source. So we mustn't get too bogged down in expressions and try to go to the pith of it, try to go to the core, the heart of the matter. This is just by way of introduction, and I'm going to give you a brief presentation of the 7 poets we're going to talk about today. The first one being Kabir. Kabir is a kind of a Muslim Hindu poet. His name indicates that he was born Muslim in India, but at one point he saw a guru had gone down to the Ganges to bathe in a bath of purification. And as soon as the guru came out, he prostrated himself before him, grabbed his foot and put it on his head. And that means initiation. So he received Hindu initiation in an odd kind of way. And his whole life was somewhat of the same comportment, that he was very critical of inauthenticity. He was very critical of hypocrisy. He wanted things to be genuine. He wanted things to be real. And this got him in so much trouble at one point that the Mughal emperor sentenced him to death. But he managed to escape, thankfully for him and for us, because we have received from him much great and beautiful poetry due to his escape. And he became totally drunk with God. So Muslim, Hindu, it was all the same to him. What was important was God. And the curious thing is that he had come to be, though free from religions, he came to be unwittingly the founder of two religions, the Kabir Papi and the Sikhs. The Sikhs claim him and Nanak to be the two founders of their religion, he who considered himself free from all religion. In fact, there was a saying that in Hinduism, anyone who dies at Magahur will be reincarnated as a donkey, whereas anyone who dies in Benares, or Varanasi today we call it, will not have to be reincarnated. Will have achieved total liberation. And he says that's nonsense. He said it doesn't matter where you're born, where you live, and where you die. It's the life that you have. And so he said, I want to die at Magahar, and I'll show you I will not be reborn as a donkey. And he wasn't. And then the curious thing is, though he considered himself free from all of these things, when he died, though he had been sentenced to death by the emperor, and though he was rejected by so many people, a Muslim and a Hindu prince fought over his remains. Somehow mystics are more compatible dead than alive. They're less troublesome, you see. And so they were quarreling over his remains. And when they finally went to grab a bone of this and a bone of that, all they found were flowers. And I thought that was a very fitting response to their misunderstanding. Then we have a St. John of the Cross. St. John of the Cross, who lived in the 16th century, Spanish, a reformer of the Carmelites, which cost him very dearly. People don't always take gently to reform, even though his reform was very gentle. He was at one point, you see, all of these mystics had troubles. They all get into some kind of trouble without being mischievous. He was, in fact, imprisoned for 9 months, nearly died. It's only because he was able to escape, like Kabir was able to escape. He was so mistreated by his fellow brothers. This is the tragic thing. He was so mistreated by his fellow brothers that he was kept in a very small room, and only a very small window, very, very high up. And light only would come into his cell about 1 or 2 hours a day. And he was scourged 3 times a week to the blood, never allowed to bathe or change his clothing. And his clothing began to literally rot upon him and stick to the blood. And yet, in those conditions, with the sparse light that he received, he wrote his most sublime mystical poetry there and in Granada, where he was almost totally surrounded by Muslims. So you see, there is no such thing as a perfect condition or occasion, that you don't have to be anywhere special or doing anything special to be able to communicate with God. And his poetry is the most beautiful lyrical poetry in Spanish, and in fact, the most beautiful love poetry in Spanish, curiously enough. We have another one we're going to consider is Rumi, and I'm sure everybody knows about Rumi. Rumi was born, he was Persian. Rumi lived in the 13th century, the time of Francis of Assisi. He was born in what is today Afghanistan, but which was part of Persia at the time. And he too lived in troubled times. And in fact, the Mongols were coming and were going to attack Afghanistan, which is now Afghanistan. And so his father gathered up his family and they fled to Konya. Konya, which is in Turkey today, and those of you who know the book of the Apocalypse, the last book of the Bible, it used to be called Iconium, and now is Konya. where he is buried. And he was prepared to be a theologian and a teacher like his father, and a very, very good one. But nothing particular to signal him from other theologians, Muslim theologians. However, the first inkling that anyone had of him was, it is said, whether that's a legend or not, it is said that Ibn Arabi met his father when Rumi was just a boy. And Rumi, being a shy little boy, as so many little boys are, was hiding behind his father, holding onto his robe. And Ibn Arabi peeked behind. He said, "How strange it is that an ocean should hide behind a pond." He realized in him that, in fact, he was going to become the great Rumi, who many people consider to be the greatest of all mystical poets. In the Christian tradition, certainly John of the Cross is the greatest. Rumi, though many Iranians prefer Hafiz, I think worldwide Rumi is considered the foremost mystical poet. He's been translated into English by people like Coleman Barks and Robert Bly, and they have terribly Americanized his texts, so that you really don't know what Rumi is saying. You know what Coleman Barks and Robert Bly are saying, but they had at least the virtue of popularizing Rumi, so he's now the most widely read poet in English, curiously enough. And he's not English at all. There are other older, earlier translations done by Nicholson and Aubrey, who are English. They're stiffer, they're more formal, but they are closer to the original. I just found in Switzerland the other day a translation of his Masnavi by Meyerovich in French, which has the lovely quality of being both fluid and faithful. And I would love to see that kind of a translation done in English. I hope that we can have access to that one day. So Rumi, who was, as I said, just a kind of a staid theologian, one day met this wandering Sufi mystic, Shams-i Tabrisi, Shams from Tabriz, which was a town also in then Persia, but now Afghanistan. This man, this Shams, which means sun in Arabic, was entirely enamored of God. Entirely enamored of God, and he just radiated and poured out so much of this divine love that it knocked Rumi to the ground. He had never seen such intensity of love of God. And he says he fell in love with Shams, but we must understand what he meant by that. He fell in love with the divinity that he found within Shams. And he began to ignore his own disciples and spent all day and all night for months just together in a room with Shams, just chanting and meditating, and so much so that his disciples became envious. And there were some malicious tongues who even suggested there was more going on than just mysticism. To this day, there are those who still think that, and which is obviously not to have understood Rumi or Shams at all. And finally, there was a plot to kill Shams from among Rumi's disciples. So he fled to Damascus. And Rumi became so distraught with the absence of this lover of God that he just moaned and groaned, and for a year, until finally someone said that Shams had been spotted in Damascus. So he sent his youngest son, who was faithful to him, to go and bring him back. And he did come back, but the same thing happened all over again. It was nothing but ecstasy and chanting. And in fact, he's the founder of the Whirling Dervishes, this dance, which is a kind of a cosmic dance in which one chants the name of God all the time to the point of ecstasy. That it begins with Rumi. But his disciples, who were not at that level at all, they were still at the level of the old theologian who was teaching earlier, including his elder son, sad to say, were involved in a plot, and one day called the Shams out into the night. He walked out and was stabbed to death. And we have some of the most exquisite mystical poetry from Rumi. But again, always in suffering and torment. Another one I'd like to talk to you about is Chuang Tzu, who's a Taoist. He lived in the 4th century before Christ. He lived at a period where, again, a very tormented period in China, which was the period of the warring states, and where they were, in fact, in the process of destroying classical civilization, much the way Mao Zedong, in contemporary times, when he unleashed the Red Guard upon China, tried to destroy the old classical civilization by burning any of the old classical texts, any statues of Confucius or Buddha, one of these revolutions that happens periodically that rebels against anything higher. This Chuang Tzu, like Kabir, very much professed a freedom from all forms of tyranny. He wanted the soul to be free in the way the Tao is free. And you'll see some of his poems which indicate this. He has his sense of humor, and I think you'll catch it. And it led some of his contemporaries to think that he was frivolous. But in fact, this so-called frivolity has come down to us after 2,400 years. So it couldn't have been all that superficial. And then we have Halili, who lived in the 11th and 12th century. Halili is a particularly interesting poet. He's Jewish. He lived in Andalusia, in southern Spain, at a time when the Moors were governing Spain. You'll recall that the Moors were in Spain for 8 centuries. There was a considerable Jewish population in Spain at the time, as well as Christian population. And for a period of about 2 centuries, these 3 monotheistic religions, who genuinely have a very healthy distaste for one another, lived in great harmony, with great interactive influence among them. So much so that a lot of the Sufi images and language crept into Spanish, and as well as the Jewish Kabbalistic language and images crept into Spanish. A lot of these images and words are found even in St. John of the Cross. Now, St. John of the Cross, if he had been conscious that these were of Islamic origin, he would certainly have crossed them out of his poems, because he was living at the time of the Inquisition, at the very time when Fray Luis de Leon was thrown into jail for 5 years, simply for having translated the Song of Songs for his sister, who was a nun, into Spanish, that it was not supposed, none of the Bible was supposed to be translated. And so the Inquisition wasn't fooling around, and St. John of the Cross knew this, but it had become so much a part of the culture and of the language and the experience that very often St. John of the Cross is using Sufi images. And in fact, his language and his poetry is as amorous as anything you'll find among the Sufi poets. And though he didn't escape problems at his time, but that was because of the reform and not because of his poetry. And he was very careful to write explanations to his poems to make sure they were not taken in an unorthodox way. But the real statement comes in his poetry, and he says things there that could not be explained away in theology. It's all very interesting the way this happens. And Halili, who lived in this way, I don't expect you to remember all of these people and all these circumstances, but just to give you a little background to who we're going to be reading. And Halili, who a Jewish writer. He's the most lyrical of the Jewish writers, of the Jewish poets. He's the most lyrical Jewish poet. In his earlier years, he was a great lover of wine, women, and song. He had a particular sensitivity to lovely young damsels and enjoyed banquets and so forth. But he had a longing within him, which is so very Jewish, isn't it? To go to Jerusalem, to be able to walk upon the site where the temple once stood. This was his deepest longing, and it eventually became so spiritualized that he began writing, instead of the kind of amorous poetry to the young ladies that he wrote earlier, it became a more spiritual and elevated poetry. And in fact, so much so that much of his poetry has in fact now become part of the Jewish services that they recite as prayers, many of the poems that Halili wrote. And so he began a journey to arrive at Jerusalem and ended up at Damietta. Damietta, which you will remember, is where Francis of Assisi went to meet the Caliph at the time. A most extraordinary circumstance. The city of Damietta is being besieged by the Crusaders. Now, Francis of Assisi comes from the camp of the Crusaders and is received into the besieged city by the Caliph, who considers Francis of Assisi as a Sufi. And they spend the time there talking about spiritual things, Francis trying to convince him of the Christian way, and he trying to convince Francis of the Sufi way. And they just both got along very well. And he had free entrance in and out of the city, even though the city was being besieged by the Crusaders, which is truly a very sublime recognition of great souls among themselves, isn't it? It would be nice if we could have more of that today between Christians and Muslims, on both sides, mind you, on both sides. And so he finally made his way to Damietta, this Halili. And of course, in Egypt, he became very popular. He was very gallant and very well-educated and something of a philosopher, though he rejected philosophy, saying that philosophy was only good for the use of the mind, but could not bring us beyond the mind to mystical union. And he spent several years in Damietta writing poetry. His journey was delayed, and eventually he made it to Jerusalem. And the story has it, whether it's historically true or not, I'm not sure. The story has it. And legend isn't to be eschewed, because very often legend captures better the spirit of a thing than the actual historical recording. For example, you have the little flowers of St. Francis. People say, well, they're legends. Well, they are. But nothing better captures the spirit of St. Francis than those little flowers, those legends. So legend is almost always based upon fact, perhaps amplified, but in the way that a seed will grow. And Halili finally, coming back to Halili, finally made his way to Jerusalem. And just as he was about to enter into the gate of the city, he was killed. So this lent to his quest, of course, a yearning to enter into the spiritual Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, which he no doubt entered there at the gates of the material Jerusalem. And we have just two more that we'll finish with. Basho. Basho is Japanese. He is Zen, but not altogether Buddhist. He didn't become a monk. He was a great wanderer, but he's very Zen in his perspective. He wrote a most lovely book called The Narrow Road to the Interior. The interior being the interior of Japan. But in fact, it ends up becoming the narrow road to the interior of our inner home, of our own soul. And he's very sensitive to the moment. He's very sensitive to every little thing with that particularly Zen sensitivity. And though he may be talking about a blade of grass, that this blade of grass takes on mystical proportions. He will talk in a very humble, simple little way about things that are not grandiose apparently in themselves, and that in fact become a reflection of the cosmos, which is taken to be, so to speak, the body of God. And Basho, he was kind of a lonely man. Of course, he was always on the move. He walked from here and there and there and everywhere. And his nickname became Basho, which means a kind of a grass hut, a kind of a hut, which some of his disciples built for him near what is now Tokyo. But he always yearned for souls where he could truly share these deeper things with. He had many admirers. This is the problem with most of these poets. They all have admirers, like Rumi and like Kabir. Kabir also was very lonely, but they seek soul brothers or soul sisters, people who can fully understand and share these things with them. Rumi found one, but he was taken away from him in a rather brutal way. And so Basho writes, he's deeply influenced by Chuang Tzu, the Taoist. He's deeply influenced by Chinese Buddhist poets like Li Po, like Tu Fu and Han Shan. There is a deep Chinese influence in him. But as I say, he's never really considered to be Buddhist, but he is very, very Zen. And his idea was always to have great freedom. He says, first you abide by the rules, and then you throw them out. Then you throw them out. Only then may you achieve true freedom. And this is true of many poets, isn't it? It's true of many poets and many painters. Turner who I have the great joy of seeing at the Tate Britain. Turner starts off with his engravings, which are very specific and very particular and very, very carefully done. And he follows the rules to the letter. And then towards the end of his life, he's thrown out all of the rules and it's nothing but light, an outpouring of light. And all of the great poets do this, and all of the great painters and mystics do this. You need a period of formation. You need a period where you have to abide by the rules. But then when the rules have brought you to where you're supposed to be, then the rules aren't too useful. Somebody once asked me, well, why is it that mystics and mystical poets always have troubles with the religious society that they live in, whether it be the church or whether it be the mosque or whether it be a temple? And it's sort of easy to understand because a mystic has had direct communion with God. And any church, any teaching, any scripture, any priesthood, any of these things are supposed to be helps along the way. They are not ends unto themselves. They are supposed to be helps that bring us to that experience of God. And once you have the experience of God, then you don't need those things anymore. And that's why that famous and somewhat shocking but very profound Chinese saying that if you meet the Buddha along the way, kill him. You've all heard that, I'm sure. What does that mean? That means that if you see Buddha, what you're seeing is your idea. It's your imagination. It's your transposition. It's not truly the Buddha, which is a state of being, isn't it? It's more than just a person. And by the same token, even Christ himself says, if they tell you, there is Christ over here and he is over there, he says, do not go. You might almost say, and I don't mean to be in any way disrespectful, you must understand me what I'm saying. If you see the Christ, kill him. That is to say, we've got to go beyond image. We've got to go beyond thought. We've got to go beyond perception. And that's why many people in Christianity, for example, who reject idolatry, in fact, idolize the idea that they have of Christ, that they practice a mental idolatry. And this is what we are called to go beyond. And necessarily, if we go beyond that, then sometimes churchmen who are receiving stipends may feel that they're being robbed of some of their tithes. So that's why they don't like mystics all very much. Mystics are a free lot and a dangerous lot to some establishments. But any true lover of God will see, even within the mosque or the church or everything, the reflections. They'll see the stammerings of these great truths. And then Milarepa, who's considered to be the Saint Francis of Tibetan Buddhists, Milarepa, who lived in the 11th and into the 12th century, started off as a rather nasty fellow. He came from a well-to-do family. Incidentally, they have just come out with the first part of a film on Milarepa. And if you have a chance to see it, do. It's very well done. I think it's just called Milarepa. Milarepa came from a well-to-do family in Tibet, but his father died when he was still young, and an uncle and aunt came and took possession of the land and the house that they lived in and just allowed them to live there as servants, usurping all their goods. And the mother, Milarepa's mother, never was able to stomach this tremendous loss and finally sent him off to study the black arts of black magic with one of these magicians. And so Milarepa, after having learned the black arts, came back and then sent a tremendous hailstorm to destroy all the crops so that his uncle and aunt couldn't enjoy the profits of it. And finally invoked thunder and storm. And when they were all gathered together and part of the village was there, thunder came crashing down and the roof caved in, killing a number of them. And so he was responsible for the death of a number of people. And then this lightning which struck at the same time illuminated him. And he realized, well, this is very bad karma. And that this is not something that he was supposed to be doing. And so he went off and found a different teacher, not one of the black arts, a teacher called Marpa, who was very severe with him. And he stayed for 7 years with this Marpa. And he was put very much to the test. Marpa would tell him, for example, you build a tower with these stones, and I want it to be in circular form. And so he worked very, very hard building this stone tower. And once it was done, his teacher said, all right, tear it down now and make it rectangular. So he had to tear the tower down and rebuild it in a rectangular way. And then once that was done, he said, all right, tear it down now and make it square. And this went on, I think, 4 times and lasted 7 years before finally he initiated him. And then he became so filled with the experience of the divine that he was able to go up into the Himalayas with nothing but a loincloth, sit in the snow, and feel so much warmth in his body from the spiritual warmth that he had, that he was melting all the snow around him. Apparently today there are still people who can do that, but I haven't tried. My hand at it. So let us go on and let us read some of these poems in the time that we have allotted to us, more to what they point to than to what they actually say. Halili, and so I'm going to use a rather traditional division here, part 1, part 2, part 3. The first part is remembering the mirror, that all things, of course, in the cosmos mirror the divine. The awakening of spiritual consciousness. This is what is called in traditional theology the illuminative stage, where a person has a strong illumination of the divine and thinks that because of that, that person is already consumed in mystical union. But then the second stage comes, and that is the cleansing of the mirror, which I call here part 2, cleaning off the mirror, freeing oneself from attachments. That is to say, going into non-attachment. And that's the purgative stage. And it's a very painful stage, and it's a stage at which a person is stripped of all that is not God, and that one begins to feel that, in fact, he's suspended over an abyss. No longer has the consolations of the earlier lights and the feelings and flush of love that it felt, and does not yet have the union. And so it's a very painful period to be in. In fact, I just received an email the other day from a Hindu lady who's going through precisely this stage and doesn't know what to make of it and feels she's losing her mind. And in fact, many mystics going through this do feel that they're losing their mind. And they are, in the higher sense of the word. They are losing the mind to go on to the spirit. And so I have to write to her as soon as our talks are over today and console her a little bit. And then we have part 3, beyond the mirror. We have to go beyond just the reflection. The seer and the seen are one. This is the unitive stage. So and that's why I've broken down the readings of the poems. If we don't have time to read them all, no matter. We'll read what we can. You take these with you, and on your own you can read them. But we'll read a few of them. And that's why we printed them out, so you can go home and then nourish your souls with the beauty of these poems. So the first one by Halili, our Jewish poet, called The Dreamer. He's speaking to his soul. He says, "Wake up from your nap, my dear. Oh, if you could only absorb in reality what you radiate. If someone kisses you on the mouth of your dreams, you'll know what you have dreamed." So this is the beginning of the awakening, the illumination. And Kabir, you'll see Kabir's feistiness here. Kabir is a very feisty, but very fiery and enamored soul. His poems, Kabir used to write his poetry in the language of the popular language of his times, the way people spoke. And you'll see that there's nothing very abstract about the way he writes, that he's speaking the popular tongue, which was a kind of a Hindi at the time. And this is why they became so popular. And people are still singing his hymns and his poems today, that it wasn't a very esoteric language, full of niceties and full of plays on words. It was very direct, and the people understood it. The Vedas are, of course, the scriptures of the Hindus, and Purana are a blind man's mirror. Can a spoon taste food? What does an ass loaded with sandalwood, poor beast, know of its sweet fragrance? Says Kabir, he always used to quote himself, says Kabir, they search the depths of the sky, but they have not met the one who would destroy their pride. And in note, I add here that when he speaks of the spoons and the ass, he's speaking about the pundits, the scholars, the theologians, and he's mocking them. He said that they're nothing but spoons. They feed out the teaching of others, but they haven't tasted them themselves. Just like sandalwood has the odor that you make incense with, but they don't know this odor of the incense and the spiritual that it leads to. And then he kind of takes a dig at the ablutions Mind you, with the profoundest respect for the ablution themselves. You'll recall that his initiation came when he grabbed the foot of the guru and put it on his head as the guru was coming out of the sacred bath from the Ganges. So he does respect it, but what he's trying to say is it's not the bath that purifies. It's not the water that purifies. No one who goes on pilgrimage with an impure heart will reach paradise. It doesn't matter if people believe that. Ram, who's one of the gods, Ram isn't that ignorant. Adore Ram, your only God. Service of the Guru is the true purifying bath. It's not just dipping into the Ganges. The true bath is service to the Guru. And ultimately, the Guru is not the man who's teaching you. It's the inner guide. It's one's spirit. That is the true Guru. If you can attain salvation by plunging, frogs also plunge and plunge again. And those who fall from birth to birth resemble frogs indeed, the reincarnation. He said, if you have to keep reincarnating and reincarnating, you're not much better than a frog. And a frog jumps into the pond every time, just like you go into the purifying baths, but it doesn't do you much good. And here's where he talks about, remember I told you, the dying in Benares, or the dying in this other city where he chose to die in. He says, the man who dies in Benares with a heart full of wickedness cannot escape hell. But if one of Hari's another name of God, if one of Hari's saints dies in Magahar, a whole multitude is liberated, instead of being reborn as a donkey. The Lord without form, the transcendent God, the Lord without form dwells where there is neither night nor day, neither Vedas nor scriptures. Says Kabir, O men, meditate on him alone. The world has gone mad. And then he has, there's one, we'll read two more of his poems before going on. Kabir also says, hey, Pundit. Just addressing him in that way is already kind of demeaning. So, hey, Pundit, be careful what water you drink. You remember that the Pundits, and here he's referring to the Orthodox Brahmanic purifications. You remember that according to the caste system, for example, if someone had just come out of the Ganges and was purified, but if an untouchable walked past him and his shadow touched him, he was already impure and had to go back into the Ganges to bathe again. Just the shadow of, very different from the shadow of Peter, isn't it? Where Peter's shadow was healing people instead of impurifying them. So he's mocking this, it's just, what is this nonsense of just the shadow of a man making you impure? Hey, Pundit, be careful what water you drink. The entire universe is contained in this earthen house where you are sitting. Myriads of Madhava and 88,000 ascetics have died where you are now. Prophets are buried at every step. The earth is made from the rot of their bodies. That's the earth your jug is made of, O Pundit. That's what you drink out of, Fish, turtles, and crocodiles have given birth to their young in the river. Its waters are full of blood. The river water carries unclean things. Men and beasts have become putrefied in it. You see, it is the common language, isn't it? It's not very academic. The bones have dissolved, the marrow is melted. That's what milk comes from. And that's what you've had for breakfast, Pundit. Yet you become disgusted because of a pot. Put the Vedas and holy books behind you, O Pundit. They are only empty fictions. Says Kabir, listen, O Pundit, your religion is made of such foolishness. So, your religion, he doesn't say religion, your religion. People who just limit themselves to outward practices and haven't gotten to the kernel of it. He says, like, you drink water out of pots, and yet the water's from the river that's full of impurities, and the pot itself is made out of dirt made from rotted bodies, and that's what you're drinking from. And you don't seem to realize that that's not true religion. That true religion has nothing to do with these things, that we know where we come from and we know where we're going. So we can skip the next one, except perhaps the very last paragraph of it, last stanza, where he says, they all say that he, God, is both the body and the universe, that he has neither beginning nor end. What is beyond the body and the universe, says Kabir, is Hari. And now we go on to Basho. Basho is so delicate, so very different from Kabir, who's talking about blood and marrow and crocodiles and so forth. Basho is so very delicate, so very Zen. And he's talking about the same things, but in a very different way. Just look at how much is packed into this one haiku poem. It says, summer grasses, all that remains of great soldiers' imperial dreams. Because, of course, the soldiers have been killed. They've been buried. Their bodies rot and becomes part of the soil. And that soil gives birth to the grass. So the great imperial dreams, all this nonsense that some people direct their whole lives with, summer grasses, all that remains of great soldiers' imperial dreams. And when he speaks of death, you know how some people have to be buried in a grandiose manner. They want to be buried with a lot of ceremony. They have to be somebody. Tremble, O my grave. In time, my cries will be only this autumn wind. That, what is his grave? His grave is nothing. That we are all one with nature. That the cries of the dying are become nothing but the autumn wind. That we are part of nature. We are part of creation. We are an integral part of the pot and the water that we drink it from, aren't we? And that all of this is the mirror, all of this is the reflection of the great cosmos, which is a perfect reflection of the divine. And another one from Basho, pitifully, under a great soldier's empty helmet, empty because the soldier is dead. Under a great soldier's empty helmet, a cricket sings. So he's trying to show us the vanity of all things that are not the one thing that matters. Milarepa is a bit long here. I'll let you read this at home. I think that it's very much worth reading. And but since it's long, we'll continue because we don't have that much time left. Rumi, let's just read the second poem on page 3. His second poem, Song of the Reed. Because I want to leave some time for any questions or comments or things that people would like to make. Listen to the reed and the tale it tells, how it sings the sorrow of separation. Ever since they cut me, Rumi, ever since they cut me from the reed bed, my wail has caused men and women to weep. I want a heart that is torn open with longing, so that I may share the pain of this love. Whoever has been parted from his source longs to return to that state of union. At every gathering I play my lament. I am a friend to both happy and sad. Each befriended me for his own reasons, yet none has searched out the secrets I contain. My secret is not different than my lament, yet this is not for the senses to perceive. The body is not hidden from the soul, nor is the soul hidden from the body, and yet the soul is not for everyone to see. The flute is played with fire, not with wind, and without this fire you would not exist. It is the fire of love that inspires the flute. It is the ferment of love that completes the wine. The reed is a comfort to all estranged lovers. Its music tears our veils away. Have you ever seen a poison or antidote like the reed? Have you seen a more intimate companion and lover? With love, this earthly body could soar in the air. The mountain could arise and nimbly dance. Love gave life to Mount Sinai, O lover. Sinai was drunk. Moses lost consciousness. When the rose is gone and the garden faded, you will no longer hear the nightingale's song. The beloved is all, the lover just a veil. The beloved is living, the lover a dead thing. It's an extraordinary poem, and I hope you'll reread it and delight in it as it deserves. Chuang Tzu, I'll also let you read on your own, so we can move into the next section. And I want you also to read some of the St. John of the Cross, but we will read some of him later. And we'll go into part 2, the after the illumination, after the finding of the mirror, the cleansing off of the mirror. But as I said, the soul, having experienced this, feels that it is one with God, but it's not yet one with God. That it has to acquire virtue, it has to purify itself, it has to rid its soul of all that is not God. And that's quite an undertaking. And it can be very difficult. And as I said, the soul, what Kierkegaard calls the leap of faith, this over the abyss, that we go over an abyss, we are suspended. We have nothing more that guarantees, that makes us understand. We've lost the security of the worldly life. We've lost security even of the lover's life. And we are over an abyss, and we've not yet acquired the unity, the union of the soul with God. It's it's the dark night of the soul that St. John of the Cross talks about. And any of you who've ever gone through this to one degree or another, and there are many degrees, and it may last many years, and may go on simultaneously with the illumination and with the union, that these, I have made them into 3 different phases, but they're not dry and clean cut. They overlap. And sometimes the soul will go from one to the other, and then go back, and then go forward, and then go back. We have only made a distinction to try and discern somewhat what is going on here. And we've read some Halili, so we're going to skip his, and we'll go on to page 5. And it's a bit long, but worthy of our reading. It says on page 5, in the second column, from the spiritual canticle, whither hast thou hidden thyself? Now the soul is yearning. The soul yearns for the God that it has tasted. Whither hast thou hidden thyself, and hast left me, O beloved, to my sighing? Thou didst flee like the hart, having wounded me. I went out after thee calling, and thou wert gone. Shepherds, ye that go yonder through the sheepcotes to the hill, if perchance ye see him that I most love, tell ye him that I languish, suffer and die, and it is a great languishing of the soul indeed. Seeking my loves, I will go o'er yonder mountains and banks. I will neither pluck the flowers nor fear the wild beasts. I will pass by the mighty and cross the frontiers. One becomes fearless. The only thing that begins to matter in this state is not even what people think of us. Is that at this stage, the mystic has even lost his reputation, the dearest of all possessions, the one that we feel most injustice we should possess, that we begin to act sort of as madmen, or at least mystics do, begin to act as madmen from the point of view of the average person. And this madness is frowned upon by the average person. It's no longer considered a normal state, so that we even lose our reputations, don't we? We lose those things that are dearest to the souls. Members of our family begin to reject and not understand. Like Jesus said, that I have come to divide, that where there are 5, 2 will be against 3 and 3 against 5, father against son and son against father. It's a way of that we go beyond the strictly human, the merely human, and that there is a division. I have come to bring a sword, not peace, says Jesus, for this inner war, for this inner jihad. This is the true Quranic meaning of the jihad. It's not going out and slaying non-believers. It's the slaying of that which is non-believing within oneself. And this is what we must remember. Verse 4, O woods and thickets planted by the hand of the beloved, O meadows of verdure enameled with flowers. There is the realization of all this beauty around us, but it's not enough anymore. Say if he has passed by you, because of course he has passed by you, that God is to be found in the beauty of nature. Scattering 1,000 graces, he passed through these groves in haste. 1,000 graces indeed, His glance alone, and looking upon them as he went, left by them by his glance alone, clothed with beauty. And all of the beauty that he sees just reminds him of the beauty that he once saw, the higher beauty, the great beauty of the capital B. Who will be able to heal me? Surrender thou thyself now completely. From today do thou send me now, no other messenger. He doesn't want the beauty of nature anymore. He doesn't want all of these flickers of the divine beauty. He wants the beauty itself. For they cannot tell me what I wish, and all those that serve relate to me 1,000 graces of thee, and all wound me the more, and something that they are stammering leaves me dying. But how, O love, life, dost thou persevere? How can I go on living? Since thou livest not where thou livest, and since the arrows make thee to die, which thou receivest from the conception of the beloved, which thou formest with thee. These are the arrows of love, the arrows that pierce the soul. You remember in reading the life of Teresa of Avila, that she was pierced and she saw materially that which took place spiritually, where a seraphim came with a fiery arrow and pierced her soul, pierced her heart. And it was a great anguish and yet a great delight that there is a suffering for the natural part of ourselves and a refreshment and great delight for the spiritual part of ourselves. It hurts to be enlightened, but it also consoles profoundly to be enlightened. 9. Since thou hast wounded this heart, wherefore didst thou not heal it? And wherefore, having robbed me of it, hast thou left it thus, and takest not the prey that thou hast spoiled? We feel we've become the prey of God. Quench thou my griefs, since none suffices to remove them. And let mine eyes behold thee, since thou art their light, and for thee alone I wish to have them. O crystalline fount, if on that thy silvered surface thou wouldst of a sudden form the eyes desired, which I bear outlined in my inmost parts. And this is the inner eye that he's talking about. This is the inner eye that St. Augustine of Hippo talks about. That just as we have an eye for the material senses, so do we have a spiritual eye for the spiritual senses, so to speak. Withdraw them, my beloved, for I fly away. Well, that's a very intense poem. Reread it yourselves when you have a moment. And we have some Kabir, and we have to kind of hasten through, I'm afraid. And we'll skip him since we read several of him in the first section. But here too, Kabir talks about how can he possibly begin to survive after having seen God in vision. But we'll read Basho, who is intense in a very different kind of way. The month's last night, moonless, 1,000-year-old cedar embraced by the storm. The cedar feels the storm, the soul feels the storm, but it's 1,000-year-old cedar, its roots are deep. The soul is already strong and solid, has been through many purifications. And on his peregrinations, Basho came to Isa, where there's a beautiful shrine, and he says, behind Isa shrine, unseen, hidden by the fence, Buddha enters nirvana. There's a statue of Buddha there at the shrine, but he's not talking about the statue, the material Buddha. It's the Buddhahood which he experienced, which enters into nirvana. We'll read a little Chuang Tzu. In an age when life on earth was full, no more paid any attention to worthy men, nor did they single out the man of ability. Rulers were simply the highest branches on the tree, and the people were like deer in the woods. They were honest and righteous without realizing that they were doing their duty. They loved each other and did not know that this was love of neighbor. They deceived no one, yet they did not know that they were men to be trusted. They were reliable and did not know that this was good faith. They lived freely together, giving and taking, and did not know that they were generous. For this reason, their deeds have not been recorded. They made no history. Which is another way of saying that the greatest experiences of the soul are unwritten. They don't make history. The poems may remain, but not the experience. We'll have to skip Milarepa again, unfortunately. And I do want to read a Rumi down at the bottom of the page, page 7. Because here you've got all of this understanding of the I and the thou that Buber talks about. A certain man came and knocked at a friend's door. His friend asked him, "Who art thou, O trusty one?" He answered, "I." The friend said, "Begone, 'tis not the time for thee to come in. At a table like this, there's no place for the raw," meaning that he's uncooked still. "Save the fire of absence and separation," the fire that'll do the cooking. "What will cook the raw one? Who or what will deliver him from hypocrisy?" The wretched man went away, and for a year in travel and in separation from his friend, he was burned with sparks of fire, spiritual fire. That burned one was cooked, Then he returned again and paced to and fro beside the house of his comrade. He knocked at the door with 100 fears and respects, lest any disrespectful word might escape from his lips. His friend called to him, "Who is at the door?" He answered, "'Tis thou art at the door, O charmer of hearts." "Now," said the friend, "since thou art I, come in, O myself. There is no room in the house for two eyes." I love this poem. They're lovely. Rumi is just like that. I cannot recommend him highly enough. But tempus fugit. Time flies. So let's go on to part 3 on page 9. I do wish I could read them all to you, but I deliberately put more than could be read in them, knowing they couldn't all be read, but knowing that, or hoping at least, that enough of the fire would be lit that you'd go home and want to read them all. I do hope you will. Part 3, Beyond the Mirror. The seer and the seen are one. Halili, who was so charmed by material beauty for so long and understood his journey to Jerusalem as a material thing also for some time, came to understand more deeply this idea of God. How sweet and delightful it is to rest in your chambers, for those whose brow radiates with your name. Name that rings in the world's high center and palpitates in the disheartened creature of sorrow. The furthest heavens were unable to sustain it and let it come down, burning upon the bush of Sinai. Very long and very short is the way that leads to him, to what is by him, to what is for him. I bear the idea of God in my entrails, and in the root of my tongue, the echoes of his eloquence. You see now here, the idea of God is no longer a cerebral thing. It's all one with him, within the root of his tongue, in his entrails, which are symbolic ways of speaking of his inner self. And Kabir, I'm trying to see which of the poems of Kabir here, because we'll have to choose. Oh, read them all. And we'll go on to page 10. And this probably most famous of all of John of the Cross's poems, The Dark Night of the Soul. Now, here again, he's going to be speaking in material terms. See to what they point. On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings, O happy chance, I went forth without being observed. My house, my inner house, my house being now at rest, in darkness and secure, by the secret ladder, disguised, O happy chance, in darkness and concealment, my house being now at rest. It's the soul going up to God. In the happy night, in secret, when none saw me, nor I beheld aught, without light or guide save that which burned in my heart. This light that guided me, more surely than the night of noonday, to the place where he, well I knew who, was awaiting me, a place where none appeared. Oh, that night that guided me, oh, night more lovely than the dawn, O night that joined beloved with lover, lover transformed in the beloved. It took him some trying to explain that one away, so the Inquisition wouldn't be too hard on coming down with the total union of the self with the self with a capital S, the true self, the inner self. But he said it. Beloved with lover, lover transformed in the beloved. Upon my flowery breast, kept holy for him alone, where he stayed sleeping, and I caressed him, and fanning of the cedars made a breeze. The breeze blew from the turret as I parted his locks. With his gentle hand, he wounded my neck and caused all my senses to be suspended. Ecstasy, huh? I remained lost in oblivion. My face I reclined on the beloved. All ceased and I abandoned myself, leaving my cares forgotten among the lilies. Oh, this is just so utterly beautiful. The second poem of Basho in the next column, you'll remember this the next time you have tea in the morning. Taking morning tea, the monk remains in silence. 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 We're going to trim down the number of poets that we read and limit them to 2. This morning we dealt with 7, and this afternoon we're going to deal with just 2 poets who have the particularity of being both ladies. Ladies of extraordinarily different backgrounds, and who end up with much the same experience. Rabia, who is Muslim, and Mirabai, who is Hindu, a Krishna devotee. Both very fascinating women very independent for their own days, for their own times, women who had very strong personalities and very intense love of God. It drew down upon them a fair amount of criticism and oppression, but they seem to have both triumphed very, very well. Rabia lived in Basra in southern Iraq, and we hear a lot about Basra now with the war going on. British troops have been stationed there. At a time when there was a great shift in Islam, she lived about 2 centuries after the Prophet Muhammad, and the Umayyad dynasty had been ruling from Syria, but there is a shift that's going on. That dynasty is going out, and there's a new one coming in Baghdad. So there's a shift of power from Damascus to Baghdad, and from Baghdad, of course, it filters down into Basra. Basra is a city, it's a port city. It's a center of many encounters. Of course, port cities always are, aren't they? There's a lot of traveling that goes on. And there are Buddhist influences, there are Christian influences. And so the quality of Islam gradually begins to change. There are other elements that come in. With the tremendous political power and the tremendous material wealth that came with the expansion of Islam, came a corresponding degree of corruption. The heads of the various governments were leading very, very oriental lives, full of luxury, full of comfort, and the teachings of Islam took a very second place in their lives. So there began to be in Islam a reaction against so much laissez-faire, so much corruption that was coming in. And you had a whole ascetical movement that began. In this asceticism, you get a good deal of passivity. That God is God and all you can do is just submit to him and endure whatever he sends you. You have a lot of quietism. You have a very harsh concept of God. There is nothing of a relationship between the soul and God. That all you can do is be penitential, be very ascetical. And this was considered to be a good antidote to the great luxuries of the Islamic world at that time. And don't we see the same thing in Europe later with Francis of Assisi, who leads a life of tremendous poverty at a time when the papacy had achieved the very highest political power it ever reached, where Innocent III was able to make and unmake emperors and kings. And here comes this monk living in dire poverty, and he was thrown out of the Vatican the first time he came. They didn't want him there, and he finally submitted a request for his rule to be approved. And the Pope had a dream the night before. He saw the church crumbling, and he saw this monk in a brown robe shouldering the church to prevent it from falling. And he recognized this little brother that had been thrown out and allowed him to come back in. He submitted his rule, and the cardinals who had to judge as to whether they were going to approve the rule or not, they said, well, this is not a very interesting situation. We don't practice the gospel, but we can't formally condemn it. So they had to approve of the rule of St. Francis. So you had something of the same situation with Rabia. The Islamic world was pretty corrupt, only after 2 centuries after the Prophet. And along came this woman, this child, from very poor background. Her name in Arabic means the fourth one, because she was the fourth daughter of her mother and father. Very, very poor. They didn't even have oil to put into the lamp or swaddling clothes to wrap her in when she was born. And her mother asked the father to go out and get some oil for the lamp. And he said, no. He said, we trust. We don't ask anyone for anything. We just trust to what God is going to send us. And so, but just to placate her, he went out, but he didn't ask for any oil. And he came back without oil. And he soon died, and so did her mother. So she was an orphan very young. And famine came upon the land, and her sisters scattered. And she was out trying to see how she could find her existence, eke out her existence, when a man captured her and sold her into slavery. And the man that had taken her into slavery was without being a cruel man, he was something of a taskmaster. She had to work very, very hard. And at one point, she had to go out and do an errand, and a man with malicious intent, a man who didn't have the right, according to the laws of Purdah, to see her unveiled, came up with intentions upon her body. And she ran away and escaped and stumbled and fell face first into the dust and hurt her wrist. And then she said, oh, dear Lord. She said, what is going on? I have lost both my parents. I've been sold into slavery. And now I'm hurt. And she had just discovered the corruption of man. But she said, the only thing that's important is that I be pleasing unto you. So she made her way back to the place where she was owned, and she used to work very hard all day and spend most of the night in prayer. And then one night her owner woke up, and he went to the window and he saw her prostrated, praying. She was praying loud enough for him to hear. And he was utterly surprised to see suspended over her head an oil lamp without any chain to hold it up, that was spreading light throughout the house. And he realized that he was dealing with a very saintly person. And the next morning he told her, he said, I'm going to set you free. You can either be the mistress of the house here and we will serve you, or you can go away and take your freedom. And she opted for her freedom. So she went away and lived in a little hut on the outskirts of Basra. And there she spent her entire life in prayer. She was praying almost all the time, and her necessities were reduced to so little that when one lady went to be her servant to help her, just to be near her, all she saw was a reed mat, a pitcher for the water, and a brick to lay her head on when she slept. She practiced a tremendous degree of poverty, but she said God will always provide. And in fact, she always did have something to eat. And it reached a point where people were bringing little bags of gold to bring to her, and she would just send them away. She said, if I buy a house with this, and there'll be beautiful things in the house, I might start getting attached to the house instead of to God. And she says, no, please go with your gold. Thank you, but no. And eventually sages began to come to see her, and holy men, and asking her all kinds of spiritual questions. And sometimes trying to show her their degree of knowledge. She had one man who came to her and said, are you advanced enough in the love of God that you can float on the water? Because I can. And he put his rug on the water and sat on the rug and it didn't sink. Well, she says, you're not doing any better than a straw would do. She's floating on the water. She said, as far as that's concerned, she just flapped her little rug, her little mat, floated up in the air over the water. She says, that's nothing more than what a bird can do. That has nothing to do with God. That she didn't consider that any of those miraculous powers were of any interest for a true lover of God. So he realized that she perhaps did know more and was perhaps more advanced than he had thought she was. And she even had men who came to propose marriage to her. And she looked at the shoe. What do you mean, marry you? I don't even belong to myself. How can I belong to you? She said, besides, I have a husband. And she said, a very faithful one. So she introduced into Islam, which at that time had been, as I said, either corrupt or austere, very austere. She introduced into Islam an element of love that, as I said earlier this morning, that the theologians didn't think that there could exist, the Muslim theologians didn't think there could exist a relationship of love between a human being and the transcendent God, the Godhead, what we would call the Godhead. And so they never developed that aspect of the relationship to God. Whereas she became so enamored of God, contrary to all the precepts of her times. Remember, she's an orphan. Even her name, which is very, very long, Rabia Dawiya, something or other than Basriya. It's a long, long name. But she doesn't have her father's name, which is obligatory in that time because her father was dead. And she didn't have her husband's name, which was obligatory at that time, just the name of her tribe and her clan. And so for an Arab of the time, that would be something akin to being an untouchable in a Muslim society. Someone without roots, someone without family. And family was very, very important and still is in the Muslim world. Celibacy was not only not practiced, but there is a surah in the Quran where Muhammad specifically warns against the practice of celibacy and does not want anyone to be corrupted by Christian monasticism, and considers that that this is the way that God intended for each man to have a wife and each wife to have a husband, and that practicing celibacy was a very dangerous thing because we are dealing with energies which, if they are repressed, can become very dangerous. And in that, he's speaking rightly. You can't just repress them. However, under something of a Buddhist influence, there were elements in Islam 2 centuries after Muhammad who began to understand, and also greatly through the influence of Christian monastics, that celibacy ought not to be a denial of marriage, but simply choosing of a freedom that would allow one to consecrate oneself and one's time more fully to God. And that instead of just considering that one was repressing sexual energies, that the containing of them would somehow release, we would call it sublimation, would somehow release higher spiritual energies, like the Kundalini that you all know about. And so, even though the Prophet had discouraged his followers from being celibates, the idea of celibacy began to seep into Islam at that time. And she remained celibate all her life. And in fact, became a very, very strong spiritual leader. She became one of the founding Sufis. I call her the mother of Sufis. Because women at her time did not enjoy the highest rank in Islamic society. Not so much that the Quran belittled them. It was more of a cultural thing. As I said, if she didn't have a father or didn't have a husband, she was already considered to be something of a nobody, and women were supposed to obey and submit and be quiet. And the sheikhs were the men, the sheikhs, the gurus, the spiritual guides. But she became highly regarded as a kind of a sheikh in her own right. And in fact, Ibn Arabi, who's considered the proof of Islam, Ibn Arabi has so much authority in Islam that they call him the proof of Islam. He speaks of Rabia as being certainly one of the greatest founders and lights of Sufism. I'll give you a little account also of Mirabai. Mirabai lives in the 15th century in India. She's Hindu, of the Vaishnava tradition, the devotees of Krishna. She was married young to a prince who was not of the Vaishnava tradition. Now, she was already a very strong-minded and her family would say strong-willed girl, because one day she was a little girl, she was watching out the window, and there was a wedding procession going by, wedding party. And her mother was there, and she says, "Mama, who's that man next to the lady all dressed up so beautifully?" So that's her husband. And she said, just a little girl. And she says, "And where's my husband?" And they had a little statuette of Krishna. So the mother said, "Oh, that's your husband." So the little girl went over and took the Krishna to her room. And from that moment on, married Krishna. She began to clothe him and to bathe him and bring food to him. And much the way little girls would do with a doll, their little dolly, she began treating this little statue of Krishna. And of course, the parents paid no heed to it. They thought, this is just a little girl playing with her dolls, you see. Except that she wasn't playing with a doll. She was really venerating her Lord, that her mother had said she was her husband. So she took it to be her husband, that Krishna is my husband. And from that very young age, and then she was eventually married off to a prince, of course, without consulting her. After all, what does a woman have to choose who she's going to marry? And so after the marriage ceremony was over, she told her husband, she said, "Well, you realize, of course, we're not going to sleep together." She said, "I'm already married." To Krishna. And he was noble-minded enough that he allowed things to be carried on the way she chose. And in fact, they truly seem to have loved each other. They seem to have had a very warm relationship together. Though she had laid the law down, which was, of course, unheard of in Hindu society at that time. I mean, not only was the caste system very much in vigor, but family relationships were very much in vigor, that she was expected to do great reverence and veneration to her mother-in-law. And she says, "Well, she's your mother, but she's not my husband's mother." And so she wouldn't carry out the daughter-in-law's duties towards the mother-in-law. Of course, that set things off. And she didn't worship the same deity that they did. And they said, "Well, of course, now you're going to have to leave Krishna and worship the way we worship." And she says, "Oh, no, I'm not going to do that. He's my God and my husband." So she continued to worship. And at one point, a wandering sadhu, and these are wandering beggars, huh? They're holy beggars, but they're wandering beggars, which are very low class. And she, now a princess, was not expected to have anything to do with lower classes. And she would give him food. And at one point, he gave her a little statue, whispered words into her ear, which were in fact words of initiation. So this merely confirmed her in her devotion to Krishna. And then her husband went out to battle and died very young. And then her father-in-law, who was more tolerant of her than the mother-in-law was, also died. And so she was left with a family that began to treat her with some cruelty. Then finally, a member of her own family said, "Well, I'll take you away," and brought, I think it was an uncle, and brought her to his home, but he died very soon. So by the time she was about 25, even though she was technically a princess, what was she doing? She was going out to meet the Krishna devotees, who were often lower class people, and she was dancing with them and the music and chanting and so forth. And this was considered totally unspeakable and unacceptable for someone of her rank. And the family was so humiliated, and the family was so put out by this, that on 2 occasions, they tried to kill her, literally. Mystical poets don't always have an easy time of it, you know. One time they tried to poison her, and she makes mention of that. We're going to read that. She makes mention of that. At one time, they told her, this is the foot wash of Krishna. That is to say, when they bathed the deity, it was considered a very holy water, and the true devotees of Krishna would drink the water. And it wasn't, it was poison. They said, well, she'll drink the poison, that'll be the end of our troubles with Mirabai. And she knew what that was all about. She knew that it was poison. And she said, well, turn it into your own foot wash, into your own holy, blessed water. And she drank it and felt better than ever. The poison took no effect. And then the same thing happened. They sent her a poisonous snake, a black snake that was very highly poisonous, in with some, like Cleopatra, with fruit or flowers. And of course, she was expected to put her hand into it and get bitten. And again, that would be the end of their troubles with Mirabai. But her devotion was such that it turned into a black stone, which was a symbol of the divinity. And so she took it, this is a boon. So she took it to herself out of worship. But she knew there was a serpent in there. And finally, towards the end of her life, she took refuge in a temple, a Krishna temple on the Arabian Sea. And of course, she would start talking to Krishna, and Krishna would talk to her. And there were jealous relatives who were listening and said, she's receiving a man at night. She's a widow. She has no right to. One of the things that disgruntled her married family was when her husband died, they expected her to immolate herself on the pyre of fire, the suti, as any good widow would do. Well, I'm not going to burn myself on a man's pyre who's not my husband. And so she refused to do it. And this was just scandalous at her time. So here she finally, towards the end of her life, took refuge in this temple. And people listening at the doors, eavesdropping, could hear her talking at night very amorously. But it was to Krishna. And they said, she has a man in there at night with her. And she's not supposed to have any men with her. She's a widow. And so they decided that they were going to capture her. So one night, they locked all the doors. And they said, now we've got her. And if there's a man who's hiding in the temple, we're going to find out. So there she was at night again, talking to her beloved. And there at the door, listening, there she goes again. She was hiding her beloved. So in the early morning, when they came and opened the doors, they will catch both of them together. All they found was her sari draped over the statue of Krishna. And the legend is, or the belief is, that she was absorbed into Krishna. You know the story of Krishna at Vrindavan, where he was with Radha and had all these gopis, these milk herds women, who were dancing about and who were enamored of him. And because he's a representation of the divine love. Krishna is a representation of divine love, which the Muslims did not have any representation of, you see. And she considered herself a reincarnation of Radha, or certainly one of the gopis, because Krishna was her husband. And her poetry is very amorous. She's very much in love with the Krishna as you see him often represented with a flute, an adolescent, a kind of a bluish black complexion. And she calls him by many names. And you'll see in the poetry, every time she gives a name, it's always Krishna. She hardly ever uses the name Krishna. She'll call him Shyam and Hari and other names like that. But it's always Krishna, who goes by many names. The multiplicity in unity, you see. So let's start reading some of the poems, if you'd like. And we will try to read a few more of them than we're able to read this morning. And there are fewer of them to begin with. And just one anecdote in the very beginning in part 1, which is Rabia, the mother of Sufis, who lived in the 8th century of the Christian era. When asked by Sheikh Hassan al-Basri how she discovered the secret of self-realization, she responded, "You know of the how. I know of the how less." In other words, you know how. You use the mind. You can explain things. I don't analyze the things. I don't look into the how. I don't try to understand what is happening. I simply unite myself to God without a how. And then she, at one point, she told one of the devotees, she says, "May God steal from you all that steals you from him." And she had such a radical concept of God only, God alone, that God was the only true reality, and that we are somehow just offsprings, and you might almost say offscourings of the one reality, which is God. So everything in her life was related to God. She didn't look for personal comfort. She didn't look for riches, for food, for security, for social status, for a husband. None of these things, which she could have had and which she always rejected. She always lived as a celibate and in the greatest poverty. And one time, somebody asked her, and I don't remember if I have that poem in there, they said, "You know enough to be an abbess. You could be the abbess of a monastery." And oh, she said, I'm the abbess of myself. She said, and she makes some allusion to this here. She says, "I'm very careful what I let in, and I'm very careful what I let out." Just like in a nunnery or in a convent, you don't just let anyone in, and you don't let the nuns go out and just go anywhere, you see. So she said, "Oh, I'm an abbess, but an abbess of myself." She was the majority of one. And she said, "I am fully qualified to work as a doorkeeper. And for this reason, what is inside me, I don't let out. What is outside me, I don't let in. If anyone comes in, he goes right out again. He has nothing to do with me at all. I'm a doorkeeper of the heart, not a lump of wet clay." A house, because of course they often used to have clay houses, you see. She was so conscious of the presence of God in her that she was very, very careful not to have any kind of worldly association. She was very careful what ideas she would let enter into her mind. If people came to see her, like she said, if they didn't belong there, if they weren't people who were truly united to God, they wouldn't stay long. If someone came in, they'd go right out again, because they'd have nothing to do with her at all. And yet she wasn't a harsh person. One can have the image of her sometimes as being a hard and a harsh person, which she was not. Any more than John of the Cross. John of the Cross is often taken to be, or thought to be, a very hard person with his nada, nothing, nothing, nothing. He was so austere with himself. The kind of person who gives the steak to others and keeps the dry bread for himself. Many spiritual teachers do the opposite. Many spiritual teachers make it hard on their disciples, but they take their own eases for themselves. Not so with Rabia. Rabia was as kind and as sweet with especially seekers of God as she could be, and John of the Cross also. In fact, if John of the Cross ever had to go out of the monastery, to preach or to see another foundation or even to tend to business of the congregation, the other members of the community were just waiting for him to come back. They were so lonely for his presence when he wasn't there that when he came back, they would all kiss the hem of his robe or kiss his hand, that there was something so loving about him, despite his austerity, because his austerity was for him and the love was for the others. And this is the mark of a true spiritual master, isn't it? Very demanding of oneself and very understanding and very loving and compassionate of others. That as a matter of fact, the more holy the person, the more compassionate he is. And I always remember Vincent de Paul, St. Vincent de Paul, one day going into Paris at the time of religious wars and famine, tremendous sufferings and disorders going on. And he saw a man and a woman by the edge of the road making love to each other. Now, many people would have screamed at them and said, this is indecent and you're a public scandal and what are you doing? So he just took off his cloak and covered this. My friends, he said, just so the little ones won't see you. But when you're finished, please return the cloak. I do need it. He understood the human frailty. Doesn't mean he approved of it, but he understood it. And a true spiritual master always does. And she always tried to keep this interior life. The serving girl who came to serve her, as we read in the next poem, the serving girl told her one time, "It's spring, Rabia. Why not come outside and look at all the beauty God has made? There's a beautiful sun out there. The leaves are coming out. The rhododendrons are flowering. Let's go out and see them." And Rabia answered, "Why not come inside instead, serving girl, and see the one who made it all, naked, without veil?" So for her, the outside world, the rhododendrons and the trees and the flowering, the sun, all these beautiful things are a veil. Whereas within oneself, one sees not in a mirror darkly, but face to face, nakedly, without a veil. There is no more veil, there's no more cloistering, there's nothing anymore to divide the soul from God. And she says that in very simple words. Instead of let's go outside, why don't we go inside? Very, very different perspective. Just like you've all chosen to stay inside, even though it's so beautiful outside. So you're following in the footsteps of Rabia. And then she says, cup, wine, and friend make three. And I, thirsty with love, am four. It's extraordinary that she single-handedly, and being a woman, was able to introduce divine love into Islam. And all of the great Sufi poets who came afterwards were imbued with the spirit. She very peacefully created a single-handed revolution in Islam. And I, thirsty with love, am four. The cupbearer hands to each, one after another, the cup of unending joy. If I look, it's him I'm looking at, I'm looking for. If I arrive, then he is my eyes. And this is an idea we see in John of the Cross also, that the only way we can see God is with God's own eyes. That the identity with God becomes such that we see God as God is, because he lends to us the capacity to see him as he is. That we on our own can only go so far. We can go very far. And a lot depends upon our own personal effort. But that last stretch of the road, that last act of union, that last tremendous gap between the distance between the transcendent and the immanent, only God can cross. And he lends us himself, whereby we can see him. And if I arrive, then he is my eyes. Don't blame me if I am in love with his beauty, because by God, my ears cannot hear your slander. She considers it slander for anyone to say that you can't love God. And if we look back in our own Christian history, there are many times in history where we had the same ideas. Even when I was young, I'm not that ancient, but when I was young, we were brought up to fear God, to fear sin, and not to love God. Loving God was something dangerous, which we had to avoid. In fact, I can remember when I was a young adolescent being taught in a catechism class that to see, well, if you are going to be petting with a girl, how far can you go without committing a sin? And so the priest asked me, well, how far can one go? I said, shouldn't we rather ask how far one can go to prove to God we love him? So it was an entirely different perspective, that this preoccupation with sin that we did get from certain Christian traditions, didn't we? From the Manichaeism that crept in slightly with Augustine, from Calvin, from the Jansenists, from all different influences that marked us. And even in medieval times, if we look at the way women were looked upon, just as Islam, women were not thought apt to be able to have anything to do with religion, let alone philosophy. They just were thought to be inapt. And yet, women have always been the support of religion. Women have always treated religion more kindly than religion has treated women. And yet we have these very great feminine figures who emerge and show that at that point, and this is one of the reflections that one of the sheiks makes about Rabia, that when one arrives at this degree of love of God, there's no more man and there's no more woman. There's just this enamored being of God. We go beyond those divisions. Don't blame me if I'm in love with his beauty, because by God, my ears cannot hear your slander. Again and again, passion for God, and the bitterness of attachment to worldly things have turned my eyes into rivers. My tears don't stop falling, nor am I allowed to stay with him, nor can my burning eyes ever let me sleep. She can't be allowed to stay with him in the sense that she's still on the earth. She's still in the material condition. She can't be entirely with him all the time. She says her burning eyes won't let her sleep, at least not sleep much. And she didn't sleep very much. And her weeping was the intensity of her love of God was such that one day one of the sheiks came in to speak to her and saw that she was in intense prayer and weeping, and saw a whole puddle of water about her. And then when she finally became aware that he was there, she asked, "Why have you come?" And he said, "Well, I want to know how you were." She began weeping again, just out of love of God. And he asked, he says, "Well, do you ever find the nights long, waiting for the dawn to come and waiting for God to come?" She didn't answer. So he said, "Is it yes or no?" She said, "Yes." Of course. Of course. How could one not find the nights? And for her, the night was not the time that the sun had set. The night was the time when she was not able to experience the presence of God, the love of God. So one day somebody asked her, "Where do you come from?" From there. Where are you going to? To there. What are you doing here? I am grieving. How so? I am eating this bread, but doing that work. She was, her heart was entirely in heaven. And it is possible to begin to experience something of heaven on earth. You read that in one of Emily Dickinson's poems, don't we? It is possible, just as some people can begin to experience a kind of a hellish situation on earth, we likewise can experience something of a heavenly life here. When I was in town in Brittany last week, one part of the town was called Purgatory, and the other part was called Paradise. And so within 2 minutes we had gone through. I said, oh my goodness, we followed Dante through this Purgatory and Paradise rather quickly, haven't we? In 2 minutes we had the whole Divine Comedy done. So we had gone through. It reminds me one time in a library, I saw a library and I saw the Divine Comedy of Dante. It was registered under the theater section. So I brought it up to the librarian, cataloged, and I says, I think that this doesn't go into the theater. She says, it says Divine Comedy. Which is just as bad. One time in New Jersey, another bookstore, there was a bookstore this time, and they had Whitman's Leaves of Grass in the gardening section. So again, I brought it up to the lady at the desk. I said, this really should go into poetry. Oh, it goes into poetry, does it? I said, yes, it goes into poetry. So I assume that's where they put it. I have two ways of loving you. A selfish one, and another way that is worthy of you. Alone. In my selfish love, I remember you and you alone. And in that love, you lift the veil and let me feast my eyes on your living face. Now, what does she mean by her selfish love? She means to love God for the joy that one feels in loving God. And she always considered that something of a merchant's point of view, that if I can be rewarded with paradise, or at least avoid being sent to hell, then I'll love God. I will give my love to God in exchange for being able to go to heaven. So she considered this very unworthy, a very selfish form of love of God, and in fact, not a love of God at all. So this is the way she says, I have two ways of loving you. I can love you in a selfish way and hope that you'll grant me paradise, huh? Or in that other love where you lift the veil and let me feast my eyes on your living face. That I remember you always, or that I see you face to face. No credit to me in either. The credit is to you in both. If all I understand of you is that you can give me a reward, then that's all you've given me to understand. It's a love, but a selfish love. But even that will come from you. But if you allow me to love you, to see you face to face, that still only comes from you and not from me. See, her point of reference was God alone. God alone. There is a French saint, Louis-Marie de Montfort, who lived in the 1700s. And this was his motto, God alone, God alone. And in fact, one time he had for months and months and months, they were building this whole beautiful shrine with a kind of a reproduction of the scene at Calvary. And some nasty tongues convinced the king that he was building a fort in order to hide people who were against him. And so the king authorized the Duke of Brittany to have the whole thing torn down after so much work. And it was such a beautiful thing. And so they had it all torn down. And when this news was brought to him that everything had been torn down, of this many, many, many months of effort he had put into it, praise be God, completely untroubled by it. Because he didn't do it for the material gain or the material pride of putting up this construction, just did it for the glory of God. So either way, God could be glorified. Praised be God. That was all he had to comment. The credit is to you in both. My peace, brothers, is in my aloneness, because my beloved is alone with me there, always. I have found nothing to equal his love. She was deeply enamored of God, as you can see. That love which harrows the sands of my desert. If I die of desire, and he is still unsatisfied, that sorrow has no end. If God is not satisfied with her love and she were to die, then, she says, there will be no end to her sorrow. That is true sorrow. Not that she can rejoice in God, but she wants God to be able to rejoice in her, that she deal with God so perfectly according to his own will that he can rejoice. Isn't that extraordinary? It reminds me of Therese of Lisieux, who died at the age of 24. And before she died, she said, I'm going to spend my heaven doing my own will. And her fellow nuns were scandalized. They said, how can you talk like that? She says, my will is God's will. I do nothing but what he wills. So I'm going to have the joy of doing my will throughout eternity. This is that tremendous union, that oneness, that unselfing that takes place. That sorrow has no end. To abandon all he has made, to hold in my hand proof that he loves me, that is the name of my quest. Oh, and then, right, there is, in the next poem, there is that mention that I told you, that she's being asked in marriage. Marriage, she also says, marriage has to do with being, but where can this being be found? I should belong to you. What makes you think I even belong to myself? I am his. His. So at one point, she's talking to God, and there's a kind of an interesting dialogue. She wants God, she's asking God for a favor, to be able to practice. She already practiced tremendous poverty, but she wanted to practice total poverty, total dependence upon God. So God talks to her. God says, so you call my name. What are you asking for, really? As if he didn't know. What are you asking for, really? If it's myself you want, I'll open to you one spark of my glory and burn you out of existence. Ravia answers, oh Lord, I don't begin to have the power to come that close to you, so maybe you will give me just one grain of poverty instead of one spark of God's glory. So God said, poverty is the draft of my anger, which I've placed on the human road. When nothing is left between them and me but the width of a hair, then the hope of union turns into the reality of separation. You are still hidden from me under 70 veils. Strip them off. What can you say or know about poverty until that day? And the veils he's talking about, that God is talking about, are the veils of separation. That there are so many things that separate us from God. So much self-seeking, so much ego, so much attachment. There are so many things that separate us from God that the kind of poverty that he's asking her to practice is not having just the reed mat and the jug and the brick to lay her head on. It's the stripping away of the 70 veils. No easy task, huh? And she's very familiar with God. Lovers, in love, the same as in this love poetry, in this mystical poetry, it's exactly the same as in human love. In human love, you always get the flush of fervor. You always get this pain of separation. You get the yearning to be back together again. Sometimes you get even the little remarks that are made between lovers, which only stimulate the love all the more. And so one time, Rabia and it's the same with the love of the soul with God, huh? There is that intimacy exactly the same as between a husband and a wife. And that's why the imagery of the spiritual marriage runs through all mystical literature, all the time. At one point, she says in her prayer, she says, "Oh God, take away the words of the devil that mix with my prayer. If not, then they take my prayer as it is, devil and all." She says, in other words, I can't judge those things. I can't sort all that out. You just take it all. Just take it all. She said, if you don't take the devil out of the words of the devil, what are the words of the devil? Huh? The self-seeking, the ego, all of those things that happen. If you don't take that out of my prayer, then accept my prayer as it is, devil and all. One time somebody asked her, I don't remember the exact words, something like, won't you curse the devil? Oh, she says, I don't have any. So I'm so busy thinking about God, I don't have time to bother about cursing the devil. There's much to take enough with loving God. O children of nothing, truth can't come in through your eyes, nor can speech go out through your mouth to find him. Hearing leads the speaker down the road to anxiety. And if you follow your hands and feet, you will arrive at confusion. The real work is in the heart. Wake up your heart, because when the heart is completely awake, then it needs no friend. In other words, it's not all the human efforts. It's the work of the feet. What are the work of the feet? Going on pilgrimage. For example, a lot of people go on pilgrimage. We mentioned today a 5-star retreat center. The people go on pilgrimage and they're seeking their own comfort. It's spiritual tourism that a lot of people, not this particular case, but the people go. In fact, she even says the Kaaba, which is the most sacred, is the stone in Mecca, which is the most sacred place in Islam. She refers to that idol, the Kaaba, into which God never went and from which he never came. That she's very gallant, about the way she treats things. And yet she went on pilgrimage to Mecca several times, and praying all the while. And but it was the prayer. The pilgrimage, the goal was not the Kaaba. It was not even the purification. It was just the being with God. And one man asked her one day, he said, I've tried to go to Mecca and I always keep getting bogged down. And it takes me such a long time to get from what was then Iraq to Arabia. He said, how can you do it so fast? Well, she said, I do it so fast because you're not praying. You're just going there for the pleasure of the trip. She says, one day I was going with a donkey and the donkey died. And I looked up to God. Here I am all alone in the desert. And the donkey died and I couldn't go forward anymore. So I said, well, dear Lord, don't you want me to go to worship you in Mecca? And so what happened was the Kaaba came down before her in the desert. And that same man who had complained that it had taken him so long to get to Mecca, when he went to Mecca, the Kaaba wasn't there. And she said, oh, well, she said, I'm sorry, but it was here in the desert with me. She says, but go back. It's there now. It was quite an extraordinary person. Just to show you how detached she was from all these things. In the very bottom poem on that first column on page 2, one day Rabia needed a piece of cloth, so she gave a man 3 silver coins to buy one. After he'd started on his way, he turned back. My lady, he said, I forgot to ask, what color do you want? So it's become a question of color, has it? She replied. Give me back my money. And she threw it into the Tigris River. All I asked for was cloth. She didn't want to start with any of the vanity of what color cloth am I going to have. So she threw her money into the... Well, and there are other things, but we've reached halfway, so we don't cheat on Mirabai. We'll skip over a few. Oh, here we are. It's saying, in other words, the same thing I just told you about the devil. On page 4, the second, there are just 2 lines there. I love God. I have no time left in which to hate the devil. She couldn't be bothered with the devil and with hell and all those things. And you know, people kept wanting to give her a nice house. She was offered several times to have a nice house. And the next poem there, she says, I don't want the house. I want the Lord of the house. What could I do with the Kaaba if I had it? It's the most famous idol in the world. God isn't inside it. He isn't outside of it. The truth is, he doesn't need it. Which is rather free-spoken for a woman and a Muslim. I mean, can you imagine if anyone were to say that today, what the response would be? But she didn't care. She didn't care what they did with her. She didn't care if they put her to death. Like Al-Khalaj, Mansur Al-Khalaj, who was crucified in Baghdad. Because at one point, his love of God was so great, he fell into an ecstasy of union with God. He said, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. And this is one of the attributes of God, you see. And so the theologians around him considered this blasphemy. What they didn't consider was at that moment, when the soul is in communion with God, the union is so strong that there is no more awareness of self. So he's saying that I am the truth, is that it's the soul in God saying that God is the truth. They are one at that moment. It's only when they come out of that state can they make a distinction between I and thou. And so the theologians who hadn't experienced this, of course, thought it was blasphemy. And they crucified him for it. And so they said, do you still adhere to what you said? He says, well, it's true. He added salt in the wound. Okay, so we'll leave our wonderful Rabia and go on to Mirabai, whom I call Krishna's Gopi. Now, all of the names that are going to be mentioned here, it's all Krishna. Whether she says Bihari, Hari, whatever. It doesn't matter what she calls him, Shyam, Mohan. It's always Giridhara. It's always Krishna. So I'm almost tempted every time I come across the word just to say Krishna, just to make sure you'll understand, okay? I'll do it that way. The text says one thing, but we'll betray the translation. And you notice here, now here you have a Hindu. Hindus have no trouble with representations of God. They know that they're symbols, as we were saying at table just a moment ago. A Hindu god, if he's represented with 6 arms, or whatever the representation may be, are just symbols. It's not that they believe that God has 6 arms, for heaven's sakes. They know, they're intelligent enough to realize. In fact, even with this multiplicity of gods, the educated Hindu understands very well that these are mere attributes of God. In fact, these are attributes of God. These are not more than one God. That God is one. They play much the same role, you might say, that the saints play in Christianity. Pretty close, pretty close. One adopts one particular form of God as one's patron saint. Some will worship Shiva, some will worship Krishna, some will worship Vishnu, and so on, and Kali, and so on and so forth. These are like patron saints, but there is God. So for the Hindu, they're very at home with a representation of God, which the Muslim is not at all. In fact, you remember the terrible row that took place recently, just with a caricature of Muhammad. They wouldn't even allow a representation of Muhammad to be done, let alone of God. So transcendent is God for them. Whereas so immanent is God for the Hindu that they see everything as a symbol of God. So it doesn't matter whether you make idols of clay or stone, and these are 2 aspects of one reality, aren't they? They really, and like they will say, for example, even the strict Advaita people will say, God can present himself as God without form or God with form. It's always the same reality. We in the West, who have a very dualist mentality, we are true sons of Parmenides. We have such a dualist concept in the West that we cannot even grasp the notion of God being transcendent. And that's why, for example, we have such veneration for the Christ child born in Bethlehem, and we have Christmas and the representations and the Christmas trees and all of these things. We feel a need to represent God in some way, much like the Hindu. And though we're monists like the Muslims, in terms of our devotion, we're closer to the Hindus than we are to the Muslims. So she represents God as Govinda, who's the adolescent form of Krishna. A beautiful young man she calls him the Dark One, and how she's totally in love with him. And you'll see some of these poems are the most exquisite love poems that you'll see. And they're still sung today, 5 centuries later. They're very popular. They've made movies about her, and she's still very, very popular in India today. The songs of Mirabai. I bow to Krishna, master of the arts of love. His crown is a peacock's plume, and the tilak is that red dot on the forehead, and the tilak gleams upon his brow. His golden earrings and raven locks are waving gracefully at his ears. He is playing the flute that rests at his adorable lips. Experiencing deep joy himself, he is charming the hearts of the women of Braj. On beholding this beautiful vision of Krishna, Mirabai, swoons in ecstasy. There is a person still alive today who had an experience of Krishna. He went to see his guru, who lived in a little hut in India and lived near the forest. And he was just he was only 19. And he came to ask the guru for teaching. He says, no, you don't need teaching. He says, you need experience. He says, go into the forest and do not come out until you have experienced Krishna. So he went into the forest and stayed there for some time. And then one day, Krishna appeared to him and played the flute. And he just melted in ecstasy. And when he came out, the guru said, "Well now, how are things with you?" "I have nothing to say," he said. "Fine, now I'll initiate you." And he dunked him into the lake and initiated him. Because he said the beauty of Krishna, which was a celestial beauty, it wasn't masculine and it wasn't feminine, it was both and neither. And the music, he said, "I'm still haunted to this day by that music of the flute that I heard, which is unlike any music I have ever heard on earth." And so he said, the rest of my life, I'm just going through life haunted, enamored of God. So even today, 5 centuries later, there are people who go through the same experience that Milarepa goes on. And you know, she's always referring to the beauty of God, huh? Truth, goodness, and beauty. These are the constants. Mirabai saw God more under the aspect of truth, whereas Rabia saw God more under the aspect of truth, and she, Mirabai, more under the aspect of beauty. "Come, take up thy abode in my eyes, O son of Nand. Thy dark form is charming to look upon. Thy lovely eyes loom large. Thou hast applied the red tilak and art wearing thy crocodile earrings." Don't ask me what those are. Crocodile earrings. I've seen crocodile shoes, leather shoes and purses, but "with thy peacock plume for a crown, thy necklace of gems is hanging from thy neck, and there is thy flute, spreading forth nectar from thy holy lips." And the music of the flute is a nectar. It nourishes one. He says it's the nectar that comes from the flute. "Thy belt is adorned with small bells, and the jingling of thy anklets charms the heart. Mira's Lord is Krishna, he who watches over his devotees with love and delights the hearts of holy men." And so she is very, very much in love with Krishna. So, and this is why she's most misunderstood by her own family on the one hand, and by her family through marriage, her in-laws on the other hand. And you're going to see what she goes through. She'll mention it later on. "O Hari, thou art the support of my life. I have no other refuge but thee in all the 3 worlds. Though I have searched the 3 worlds, on the material world, the mental world, and then, of course, the spiritual world. I have no other refuge but thee in all the 3 worlds. Though I have searched the whole universe, nothing pleases me but thou, says Mira. O Lord, I am thy slave. Do not forget me." Not slave in the sense that Rabia was of this gentleman who saw her one night in prayer, but slave it's a loving service that one can't want to serve anyone but God. "My Lord is that Krishna of Gokul. All the inhabitants of Braj feel deep joy at the sight of the divine sports, and the women are enraptured. All dance and sing and clap their hands and laugh for joy." And she would do this too. There is a group, you have them here in England to be sure, the Hare Krishna people, the Krishna consciousness people. And you've probably seen them. Where they dance and they have the little bells and the Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Well, this is one of the forms that this takes, huh? And that she too was dancing in the streets. You know, oh my goodness. Imagine the family, what they thought of her going into the streets, first of all, and then dancing with common people. with bells and this, it put them out so beyond all expression. So we'll turn the page and see what more. The second poem, or the first complete poem on page 6. Sister, Krishna smiles and gazes at my body with his lustrous eyes. His eyebrows are the bow, and his sidelong glances the arrows which strike against my heart. Again, Teresa of Avila. It's all one. They all experience the same thing. It really is all one. Come, says my companion, heal thyself. See, I will draw a yantra and affix it to thy body. I will crush herbs and bring them for thee, for the odor. Like if you crush basil, sweet basil, or rosemary, something, it gives off the odor of the herb. But if thou art smitten with the disease of love, such remedies will not avail. O my companion, that impudent son of Nand, because Krishna, the whole story of Krishna, he's so human in some ways. As a child, for example, he's caught taking honey out of the pot. And his mother scolds him for taking honey out of the pot. He's just so sweet. He's always like that. And he's sort of impudent. There he is dancing with all these gopis. And it's the irradiation. It's sort of like the whirling dervishes. It's the cosmic dance. It's the cosmic dance. Krishna is the sun. And the gopis are all the planets and the stars and the suns that revolve around the sun, that he irradiates all his love and his light to them. That we can read it on a purely natural level and human level, but that would be to misunderstand the deeper meaning of the text, and in fact, the more beautiful meaning of the text. Come, says my companion, heal thyself. Right? And such remedies will not have avail. O my companion, that impudent son of Nand has made his abode in his heart, in my heart. He is holding a branch of the Kadamba tree and smiling gently in my direction. His yellow loincloth reaches to his knees. He wears a gem-studded crown upon his brow. Mira's lord is the courtly Krishna. Her mind is entrapped by his form. But by his form, it's not a material form. See, these are all representations of higher realities that she's talking about. It's not the kind of adolescent puppy love that one can experience, and I suppose we've all experienced it. I know I have. Where there's a lot of emotion and so forth. And then 6 months later, the puppy love goes to someone else. We're inconstant. It's emotion. And the very word itself says emotion. It moves on. It doesn't stay. Whereas this kind of a love has no motion to it. It's just deep. It's just constant. It grows, but it doesn't go away. It doesn't change. And the bottom one. My eyes are spellbound by the beauty of the angular pose of the Lord. On beholding the beauty of Krishna, my eyes drink in the nectar and do not blink. Attracted by the lotus petal beauty of his brows, it is as if they were now entangled in his curling, odorous locks. His body is bent at the waist, his hands curved over the flute. His turban is aslant. Even that has a meaning. You know, sometimes how young men, they're just a little cocky.
And they'll, if it's a cowboy hat, or even the kids today, they'll have these baseball hats, but it's always crooked. It's always at a slant, or the cowboy hat is at a slant, or there's just something about young men that like crooked hats. And Krishna is no different. His turban is a slant. So I can just see him, being a young man. His turban is aslant and his necklace is swinging. Mira is thrilled by the beauty of the Lord, of the courtly Krishna dressed as a dancer, because that is the particular form that he took at that time. Because God is infinite, and God takes on many forms. The whole universe, the whole cosmos shows the variety of forms that God can take. It's like a diamond that has an infinite amount of facets. And you may look at one facet now and another facet later. You may not see the whole diamond, but you're getting a facet. It's a facet of that diamond. Huh?